Erev Tov and welcome everyone. Tonight we're going to talk about Rabbi Akiva. He is considered one of the greatest rabbis in Jewish history. In many ways, he is considered a legend, which in some ways is a bit, I don't think problematic is the word, but challenging, because once a person becomes legendary, people start telling legends about them. So to be able to pick out the exact fact in fiction, there are famous stories of him that include magical journeys and time travel, et cetera, like that. So we're going to take those, not necessarily at face value, but the reality is Rabbi Akiva was a real rabbi, and he left us a great deal of wisdom. And in fact, the first place we can actually start is putting his place in history. This little chart right here is a chronology, and on the far right, you see the year 2000. That's the year 2000 from the English calendar, meaning 23 years ago. And if you go to the far left, it goes all the way back, at least according to tradition, the time of the judges. Like Samson with his hair, and also the Melachim, the kings, in the time of the first temple. The first temple was then destroyed by the Babylonians, and then you get to the time of the second temple, which was ultimately destroyed in the year 70 of the Common Era, and again, the 70 for our calendar, by the Romans. And Rabbi Akiva, we don't know the precise exact day and year, but he was born sometime around the year 50, which means that he was alive and a young man, fully cognizant in the Roman times. And that will actually come up in this class about some of his stories. So what we can do is look at a brief biography of his life, both the beginning and the end of his life. And then what we'll do is look at some of the most famous incidents about him, and then end with a few bit of pithy sayings and wisdom. But what we're trying to do is, through all of these sources, kind of get a sense of the kind of man he is. And the very second section, I'm not going to give it away, but you already get a sense of some of his very positive attributes. And it's not just about his brilliance, but about the kind of person that he was and the kind of life he cultivated. Now, this list is not exhaustive. There are some famous stories I left out just for space sake, and also in terms of his biography, the stories about his life and his death, his martyrdom, as we'll get to, are told in several different places. It's not like one consistent section like the chapter of Rabbi Akiva. The Talmud is, again, based on the shorter work from the year about 220 of the Common Era. And in fact, the person who compiled it in that year, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, Judah the Prince, we're going to learn about next week. But Rabbi Akiva is one of the voices in the Mishnah. And then the later commentary and expansion of the Mishnah, which is written between the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, is a massive compilation of earlier sources combined. And those sources are more, what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word right now, associative, meaning that if you're on a topic about idolatry, then you might start talking about idolaters. And you might get into the Romans, and you might get into how the Romans killed certain Jews for learning Torah, and then you get to the story of Rabbi Akiva. I don't think that's actually how they got to the one we're looking at, but Rabbi Akiva's stories pop up all over the Talmud where it is somehow relevant. Now, we're not going to talk about the context because, again, it's associative. It's like tangential, the way like a child's mind thinks, so it won't necessarily help us to see the context. But I'm hoping that through the reading of these sources and these stories, we'll get a sense of the man. And again, not just about his brilliance and his rulings, but about what kind of guy he was. And the first thing, I'll just read this very short source. This is the Tosefta, which means that historically it was around the time of the Mishnah, so sometime around the 1st, 2nd century. And this Rabbi Tarfon, said to Rabbi Akiva, Akiva, whoever separates from you, it is as if they separate from life. So the fact that you can get these incredible phrases, this incredible praise of Akiva to his face, because in many ways his reputation was when he was alive. He was almost a living legend in his own time, and he commanded great respect by all of his colleagues, teachers, and certainly his students. So without further ado, Tamar, I'm going to go ahead and invite you to unmute. And this first source, again, it's in the section on Ketubot, which is usually about marriage stuff, but that's not what's important. What's important is this is, with slight variations, the common story of Rabbi Akiva's upbringing, including one of the most famous things about him, but I'll let the Talmud speak for itself. So please, Rabbi Akiva was.
Rabbi Akiva was the shepherd of Ben Kalba Savua, one of the wealthy residents of Jerusalem. The daughter of Ben Kalba Savua saw that he was humble and refined. She said to him, If I betroth myself to you, will you go to the study hall to learn Torah? He said to her, yes. She became betrothed to him privately and sent him off to study. Her father heard this and became angry. He removed her from his house and took a vow prohibiting her from benefiting from his property. Rabbi Akiva went and sat for 12 years in the study hall. When he came back to his house, he brought 12,000 students with him. And as he approached, he heard an old man saying to his wife, "For how long will you lead the life of a widow of a living man, living alone while your husband is in another place?" And she said to him, if he would listen to me, he would sit and study for another 12 years. When Rabbi Akiva heard this, he said, I have permission to do this. He went back and sat for another 12 years in the study hall. When he came back, he brought 24,000 students with him. His wife heard and went out towards him to greet him. Her neighbors said, borrow some clothes and wear them, as your current apparel is not appropriate to meet an important person. She said to them, a righteous man understands the life of his beast. For Proverbs 12:10. When she came to him, she fell on her face and kissed his feet. His attendants pushed her away, as they didn't know who she was. And he said to them, leave her alone, as my Torah knowledge and yours is actually hers. In the meantime, her father heard that a great man came to the town. He said, I will go to him. Maybe he will nullify my vow and I will be able to support my daughter. He came to him to ask about nullifying his vow. And Rabbi Akiva said to him, did you vow thinking that this Akiva would become a great man? He said to him, if I had believed he would know even one chapter or even one halacha, I would not have been so harsh. He said to him, I am he. Ben Kalba Savua fell on his face and kissed his feet and gave him half of his money. The Gemara relates Rabbi Akiva's daughter did the same thing for Ben Azai, who was also a simple person, and she caused him to learn Torah in a similar way by betrothing herself to him and sending him off to study. This explains the folk saying that people say, the you follows the you. The daughter's actions are the same as her mother's.
Excellent, thank you. So this is basically the biography, not of his whole life, but of how he became Rabbi Akiva. And one of the questions I would ask when reading this story is, who is this story really about? If they're talking about a great person here, who's really the hero of this short story? What would you say, Tamar? Who's the hero of this story?
Rachel, the wife.
Yeah, the wife. The wife is the story because she's the one who, from the moment, again, he's just a lowly shepherd, nothing special about him. The famous story is that Rabbi Akiva never even started learning Torah until he was in his 40s or until he turned 40, which is a nice thing for anybody. Anyone who says, oh, I've never learned anything in my life. Well, Rabbi Akiva was the greatest rabbi in history, and look what he did. But she's the one who recognized in him this greatness, in this potential. And she said, I can help you reach that potential. I will marry you, but you have to guarantee that you're going to go study because I know you'll become a great person. Her father did not see that potential. And when he found out his daughter got married, disowned her. That's the beginning. That's the vow he took at the beginning. I won't support my daughter anymore, but she stuck to it. And Rabbi Akiva eventually came home to see his wife because he loved this woman who saw potential and trusted in him and believed in him. And then she said, boy, if I could support him going another 12 years, I would. And again, there's a bit of movie magic going on here where he hears that aside, through a microphone, and he turns around, he goes back and studies for another 12 years and comes home with 24,000 students. Now, again, all of this is certainly based on some truth. But when you get to things like the numbers, was it really 24 years? Possibly. Did he really have 24,000 students, 12 plus 12? Again, it's all possible, but it's more likely that this is the legend version of what happened, is this that older gentleman, and in thousands of years ago, 40 was probably much older, devoted his life to learning, spent many, many years there. And it's likely that he did have a wife who supported him and believed him completely. And he finally came back to town, an incredibly respected man. And this Kalba Sabua, who thought he was just a dumb shepherd, didn't recognize him. It's kind of like the story of Joseph and his brothers. And basically, Rabbi Akiva calls him on it. And when he realizes who Rabbi Akiva was, that's the end of the story. He falls down on his feet, says, I realize I was mistaken. I wish I could take it back, and gives him half his money, which again is probably one of those things like, how did Rabbi Akiva get wealthy? And then the nice little coda to the story is that Rabbi Akiva's children do the same thing, where the wife supports her husband in Torah study. And I can speak not to this extremeness. I would not want to be away from my wife for a day, let alone 24 years. But my success as a rabbi is due in great part to my wife supporting me and believing in me. So again, there's nothing really wild about this story. It's just that this man really studied for a long time, and he had a wife who fully supported him. So that's the kind of man we meet, a humble man. And she doesn't recognize him because of his brilliance in Torah. Going back again to the top, what does she see in him? She sees that he is,
Humble.
he's humble.
Humble and refined.
Yeah, exactly. That he's a respectful, honorable person. And she thinks that's the kind of person should be a great Torah scholar. So that's one of the beautiful things that I think we'll see throughout the Torah, or the story, is not about how wise you are and how much Torah you know, but what kind of person you are and what you do with it. And what he did with it is he listened to his wife, even when she didn't know that he was listening, he still listened to her. And he spent his life caring for others and spreading his wisdom and being a teacher and being committed. That's the Rabbi Akiva we meet. But unfortunately, despite all the greatness of him, he met a very terrible fate. And there's a story, I don't think I included it here, so I'll mention it and I'll skip it if it's later, that Moshe from the Torah, Moses, got a vision from God. And he went to the future to see, because he wanted to see what's going to become of the Torah and the Jewish people. And he went into the Beit Midrash of Rabbi Akiva, and Rabbi Akiva was up there teaching about all these hidden teachings, meanings, and laws behind the shape of the letters, specifically the crowns on them. If you look in a modern Torah scroll, there are crowns. Now, it's quite an anachronistic story for a lot of reasons, but Moshe says, look at this incredible man. Everyone is hanging on his every word, his every syllable. And he is, and the famous part of the story is someone said, Rabbi Akiva, how do we know all of these teachings? And he says, we got them from Moshe. So the fact that he would give attribution, that he's humble, that he's a teacher, all these things. So Moshe says, wow, what an incredible, humble, kind man. I bet he gets a great reward. And God says, no, he doesn't. He gets tortured and killed and martyred. And that's the second part of his story. And again, the second half of the class, we'll look at the middle moments of his life, but his end, unfortunately, is just as infamous as his death, because he is considered one of the martyrs under the Romans. Now, the martyrs that we talk about in Yom Kippur did not all live or were not all killed at the same time. But Rabbi Akiva's story is particularly powerful, not only because he gave up his life because he would never abandon the Torah, but because of one of the powerful teachings that's attributed to his final moments. Again, can we separately attribute this story? Do we have archaeological evidence and other versions of exactly what happened here? No. Does it mean it didn't happen? No. But what's really important is the voice of Rabbi Akiva, what Rabbi Akiva inspired in others, that this is how his death would be described. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And here we look at, and it's all the way back in the first book of the Talmud Brachot. So again, his death is told of long before his, the beginning of his life. So please, source number 2, the Gemara relates.
The Gemara relates, when they took Rabbi Akiva out to be executed, it was time for the recitation of Shema. And they were raking his flesh with iron combs, and he was reciting Shema, and thereby accepting upon himself the yoke of heaven. His students said to him, our teacher, even now as you suffer, you recite Shema? And he said to them, All my days I have been troubled by the verse, with all your soul, meaning, even if God takes your soul. I said to myself, when will the opportunity be afforded me to fulfill this verse? Now that it has been afforded me, shall I not fulfill it? He prolonged his uttering of the word one until his soul left his body as he uttered his final word one. A voice descended from heaven and said, happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, that your soul left your body as you uttered one. The ministering angel said before the Holy One, blessed be he. This is Torah, and this its reward, as it is stated, quote, from death by your hand, O Lord, from the death of the world, quote, end quote, Psalm 17:14. Your hand, God, kills and does not save. God said the end of the verse to the ministering angels, quote, whose portion is in this life, end quote. And then a divine voice emerged and said, happy are you, Rabbi Akiva, as you are destined for a life in the world to come, as your portion is already in eternal life.
Excellent, thank you. So you know this is a great deal of legend because it's talking about what happened after he died in the conversations of the angels. But again, in many ways, what's more important is how the person is used as a vehicle for certain teachings. Why would Rabbi Akiva be chosen to teach this beautiful lesson about how our very lives are owed to God? And there's an interesting other conversation here that we've had a class with some time ago about martyrdom, and our tradition sees this. But in the Shema, the central tenet of our faith here, Shema Yisrael, Hear O Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, God is our Lord, Adonai Echad, God is one. That's our central belief. And the paragraph after it, it says, love God with all your heart and with all your might and all your soul, bechol nafshecha. And the way he understands is, how can I love God with all my soul? By being martyred to God, by being willing to learn Torah, because the background of the story is the Romans forbade the Jews from learning Torah on pain of death. And Rabbi Akiva did it anyways. And there's a whole story left out here about talking to the guy in jail and everything like that. But ultimately what matters here is he felt that God was more important than anything, to the point where his greatest joy was to be able to call out his love and devotion to God in his final moments. And I'll tell you, there are stories, factual stories that I've heard from my friends that worked at Magen David Adom, the Israeli ambulance service. And they had people in their ambulances that were shot or injured, thought they were going to die. And what did they scream out with their last breath? Shema. And this could be what inspired them to do it. So again, whether or not all of these details are true, and some of them certainly there's no way for us to know, what we know is that Rabbi Akiva became a symbol for devotion to God, even to his very last breath. Now, why would they tell such a legend about this man being so devoted? And that's based on the things he did do during his life. And everything he did was in devotion to God and the Jewish people. So now that we know how he died, and again, he's not the only Jew who died or was killed by the Romans. He's not the only martyr, certainly in Jewish history, but it's the legacy that he left while he was alive. So before we go on to the next section, are there any questions here on his biography, which again, there's so much more we could say in some of those moments of his life we'll look in, but any questions on what we've seen up until now? Excellent. So Lindsay, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And this next section here I've called Rabbi Akiva's eternal optimism. That, I think, is probably his greatest trait, is no matter what, he is always optimistic. So even at the end of his life, even as he's about to die, he says, I know God will take my soul. And the angels say, why are you happy? And it's basically because he knows he's going to go to heaven. But in everything he does, every story about him, he says, it's going to be okay. Just have a little faith. So this is a very fun story and disturbing in some ways, but it's a famous story about him that could easily be turned into, and I'm sure it has, into a children's book in some ways. So Lindsay, please. And again, this is from the Talmud, as I think almost every source I have here. Go ahead, source number one there, Rav Huna.
Rav Huna said that Rav said that Rabbi Meir said, and so it was taught in a Baraita in the name of Rabbi Akiva. One must always accustom oneself to say, everything that God does, he does for the best. The Gemara relates like this incident when Rabbi Akiva was walking along the road and came to a certain city. He inquired about lodging, and they did not give him any. He said, "Everything that God does, he does for the best." He went and slept in a field, and he had with him a rooster, a donkey, and a candle. A gust of wind came and extinguished the candle. A cat came and ate the rooster, and a lion came and ate the donkey. He said, "Everything that God does, he does for the best." That night, an army came and took the city into captivity. It turned out that Rabbi Akiva alone, who was not in the city and had no lit candle, noisy rooster, or donkey to give away his location, was saved.
So could this have happened? Potentially. More likely, Rabbi Akiva wanted to teach this lesson, because all these rabbis say, I heard it from this rabbi, who heard this rabbi, all the way back to Rabbi Akiva. So it's likely as Rabbi Akiva wanted to give an example of, this principle that even when bad things happen, you have to believe that it's all for a good reason and everything will turn out in the end. And maybe he made up this story, or it's a famous folktale attributed to him as an example of this kind of lesson about these horrible things can happen, but it'll all turn out well in the end. And there's a lot of phrases, like even in modern Hebrew, people say, "Yeh beseder," it's gonna be okay, it's all gonna work out. Or Gam ze yavor, even challenging things, "This too shall pass." You may have heard that. So this is a delightful story, again, would make a great children's story, and I'm sure has. PJ Library has probably done it before, but it's an example of the kind of optimistic attitude that Rabbi Akiva held with everything he did. And we'll look at a few more examples of it. This is, again, I could say this about every source, and I probably will. This is a famous story about Rabbi Akiva. Now, it's easy to get lost in some of the details, but I only brought the whole source because it only really makes sense once you get to the end. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and invite you to unmute. And if you could please take this source number 2. It's from the section of Makot, which usually deals with legal punishments and lashings, literally what it's first to. So please, the Gemara relates.
The Gemara relates another incident involving those sages. On another occasion, they were ascending to Jerusalem after the destruction of the temple. When they arrived at Mount Scopus and saw the site of the temple, they rent their garments in mourning, in keeping with halachic practice. When they arrived at the Temple Mount, they saw a fox that emerged from the site of the Holy of Holies. They began weeping, and Rabbi Akiva was laughing. They said to him, "For what reason are you laughing?" Rabbi Akiva said to them, "For what reason are you weeping?" They said to him, "This is the place concerning which it is written, and the non-priest who approaches shall die." Numbers 151. And now foxes walk in it, and shall we not weep? Rabbi Akiva said to them, "That is why I'm laughing, as it is written, when God revealed the future to the prophet Isaiah, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to attest, Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Yeberechiah." Now, what is the connection between Uriah and Zechariah? He clarifies the difficulty. Uriah prophesied during the first temple period, and Zechariah prophesied during the second temple period, as he was among those who returned to Zion from Babylonia. Rather, the verse established that fulfillment of the prophet of Zechariah is dependent on the fulfillment of the prophecy of Uriah. In the prophecy of Uriah, it is written, "Therefore, for your sake, Zion shall be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall become rubble, and the Temple Mount as high places of a forest, where foxes are found." There is a rabbinic tradition that was prophesied by Uriah. In the prophecy of Zechariah, it is written, "There shall yet be elderly men and elderly women sitting in the streets of Jerusalem." Until the prophecy of Uriah with regard to the destruction of the city was fulfilled, I was afraid that the prophecy of Zechariah would not be fulfilled, as the two prophecies are linked. Now that the prophecy of Uriah was fulfilled, it is evident that the prophecy of Zechariah remains valid.
Excellent. So this, again, these men saw the destruction of the temple. So to be able to even go back to this place is so powerful and so traumatic for them. And his colleagues start crying because they know the death, the loss, the horrific things that happened at the destruction of the temple. And they're sitting there in tears, tearing their clothing like a mourner. And Akiva is over there busting a gut and laughing out loud. They say, what's wrong with you? You're insane. And he says, there's a prophecy that the temple will be rebuilt based on somebody who was there with Isaiah. So we know that his prophecy can come true. And there was someone else who said a prophecy that foxes are going to be running around. And there are foxes. So if that prophecy is true, and these two guys were together, then you bet what? The second guy, Zechariah, his prophecy is going to come true as well. God said there would be, the prophet said there'll be foxes, and the other prophet said the temple's coming back, so it is. That was, again, his eternal optimism. Even in the darkest moment, he believed in all his kishkas that there was hope for the future, which is why this is a famous thing. And actually, Rav Kook, that's all often quoted that pasuk about men and women laughing in the streets, because when Rav Kook went around Yerushalayim, what did he see? He saw children laughing in the street and people learning Torah. For him, for Rav Kook, he was seeing the prophecy further come true. Now, Rav Kook did not see the third temple built, nor have we, but it's not crazy for somebody to be hopeful and say, look, the prophecies are slowly but surely coming true. So there's something to celebrate. That's looking at the glass being, half full of Manischewitz. So again, an example of the great optimism of Rabbi Akiva. Oh, there's that last little line I skipped over. Go ahead, Jane, the Gemara adds.
The Gemara adds, the sages said to him, employing this formulation, Akiva, you have comforted us. Akiva, you have comforted us.
Akiva nichamtanu, Akiva nichamtanu. And it's so beautiful because it also, one of the other things to kind of, pick up on Akiva is not his Torah, which we haven't focused so much on his, there are a lot of sources about his deep, complicated Torah. We're focusing less on that because it goes without saying that he was a genius. Rather, what we're focusing on here is the kind of man he was, and talking about having a hopeful friend. We should all have someone in our life who is that positive, because we're all going to go through traumatic, difficult, challenging things. And if we have an Akiva bias that says it's going to be okay, it's really powerful. We should all be so lucky to have a Rabbi Akiva when we go through those traumatic moments. So what I'm doing in this next section here, actually, I'll pause. Any questions on those few sources there? Beautiful. I just thought those really were great demonstrations of his positivity. So this next section here, again, the rest is just more examples of Rabbi Akiva. These are slightly longer ones, but again, they're more about big principles that he stood for. So this first one, it goes all the way back to the Mishnah. So this is not even in the Talmud, and it's really powerful. Now, again, I don't want it to get lost in the halachic conversation here, but it's important to see in the context Rabbi Akiva's comments, and more importantly, that it says in the end, Rabbi Akiva is not the accepted ruling in law. But that's not the point there. The point is that Rabbi Akiva was in some ways progressive and, going against the mold, as it were. So Alina, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you could please read this source number 1 here from the Mishnah. And again, it talks about, punishments and penalties for injuring someone, like you would, in a court case. You've got to pay me this much in damages. So go ahead, please. If one strikes.
Okay. If one strikes his neighbor with his fist, he gives him a selah for boshet.
Just a coin, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, and sorry, boshet is embarrassment, meaning it's not just about, oh, he broke his nose. In addition to any damages for medical costs, there's additional payments of damages. And again, I think contemporary American law and other laws have something like that. But boshet means for the embarrassment of having to go through being beaten up in public. So give him this amount of money for the public embarrassment. Please continue. Rabbi Yehuda says.
Okay. Rabbi Yehuda says, in the name of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Amana.
There's a bigger coin.
Okay. The halacha is not in accordance with Rabbi Yehuda. If he slaps him on his cheek, the bosheth being greater, he gives him 200 zuz. If he strikes him with the back of his hand, he gives him 400 zuz. Okay. If he pulls his ear, another version, if he struck it, or tore his hair, or struck him with his spittle, or removed his cloak, or uncovered a woman's hair in the marketplace, he gives him 400 zuz. This is the rule, according to his distinction. All of the aforementioned payments are only for one of special distinction, but for a common person, the amount is less. Sorry. Rabbi Akiva said, even the poor in Israel are perceived as if they had lost their property, for they are children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Rabbi Akiva differs with the preceding Tana, holding that these penalty payments are the same for all, whether distinguished or common. The halakha is not accordance with Rabbi Akiva.
Excellent. So what they're saying here is if somebody's beaten up, whether they're just punched like in a regular brawl, or they're slapped, which is very insulting and embarrassing, or spit on. Like that's deeply painful. And what the rabbis say is it all depends on who you spit on. If you spit on a nobleman, then you pay more money. If you spit on a commoner, you pay less. Now, this actually is not so different from the Code of Hammurabi, where the idea of like eye for an eye, you would only get punished if you took out the eye of a nobleman. But if a nobleman took out the eye of a poor person, there's basically no or very small punishment there. So the rabbis are more progressive than that, and then say, no, when it's such a serious injury, you still have to pay. But here they are making distinctions between poor people and great people, and Rabbi Akiva says that's absurd. Every single Jew is a child of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. We are all children of the greatest holy men, so why should anybody be seen as better? And the rabbis in other places talk about how everyone is a child of Adam and Chava. So who's to say who's greater, who's holier, whose life has more value and more worth? We're all human beings. So even though ultimately the ruling is not according to Rabbi Akiva, at least according to this source right here, the fact is that Rabbi Akiva saw everybody as being equals in the eyes of the law, and everybody's royalty. Everyone deserves the same respect. Everyone can suffer the same kind of traumatic embarrassment. And again, that's such a beautiful thing for him to teach. And whether or not the rulings go like him, which in many cases they do, the principles that he taught, again, it's about his legacy, carry on, that everyone should be equal in the eyes of the law. And to this day, we're still struggling with that. But Rabbi Akiva had no struggle with that whatsoever. The next story that we'll look at here, the next couple ones, talk about different components, different parts of Rabbi Akiva's life that we don't focus on as much. And what's interesting is this story will sound wild, but it's actually probably something that either did happen or very likely could have happened. So we're getting now into the realm of mysticism. Now with Rabbi Akiva, we usually don't focus on his mystical nature, because mysticism, Kabbalah, was not a mainstream study. It's talked about in the Talmud, but usually when it's talked about, it says, don't talk about it. It should only be taught from an expert, very secretly, with a few students who are ready to receive it. And until the 12th, 13th century, that's basically how it was passed down. It was definitely a boys' club, but it was an esoteric teaching that was done in secret, a secret society of the mystical Kabbalistic texts. But Rabbi Akiva was a student of one of those. He was certainly an expert. So the famous story talks about a pardes, an orchard, which is code for some sort of mystical location. So the sages taught four people entered the orchard, a pardes, and they dealt with the loftiest secrets of the Torah. I'll come back to what does that mean, they entered into it. And there as follows: Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Acher, the other name for Elisha ben Abuya, who turned away from Judaism and he was considered a heretic by the rabbis, and Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, the senior among them, said to them, he was, the teacher teaching his not acolytes, but his initiates, of the secrets of mysticism. When upon your arrival in the upper worlds, like the heavens, the palaces of the heavens, you reach pure marble stones, do not say water, water, although they appear to be water, because it is stated, he who speaks falsehood shall not be established before my eyes. The Gemara proceeds to, and again, we'll come back to what's going on. The Gemara proceeds to relate what happened to each of them. But Azai glimpsed at the divine presence and died. And with regard to him, the verse states, precious in the eyes of the Lord is the death of his pious ones. So even though he died, it's a kind of martyrdom. He's not considered a heretic here. Ben Zoma glimpsed at the divine presence and was harmed. He lost his mind. And with regard to him, the verse states, have you found honey? Eat as much as is sufficient for you, lest you become full from it and vomit it. I.e., he took in too much of this mystical experience. Acher chopped down the shoots of saplings. In other words, he became a heretic. He cut down the tradition. And Rabbi Akiva came out fine. Yatzeh b'shalom. He came out in peace, complete and whole. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but basically what happened, and we learned this, is they were not magically going through a portal to another dimension. They were having visions. Were they on something, or were they simply meditating? And these mystical meditations were an attempt at recreating prophetic visions. Remember that other than Moshe, and even sometimes Moshe, the way that most prophecies in the Torah happened were through dreams. Yaakov, had a dream where he saw God and the ladder and the angels. So why can't the rabbis, in the absence of the prophets, in their dreams potentially get some sort of message or inspiration from God? So they created these basically rituals that you would sit and meditate, and you would say phrases over and over again so that you could have a specific set of visions to try and recreate the experience of going up to the heavenly palace, of seeing the throne room of God, and actually seeing, even though God doesn't have a body, you would see actual thrones and actual palaces. But Rabbi Akiva reminded them, when you close your eyes and you start meditating, whether you're on something or not, and you start having these incredible visions, don't get too caught up in them. Remember, they're just visions. If you think you see a palace, like going into like some, matrix or something, and you think it's real, you might get lost in it. Like people who get lost in some sort of psychotic or schizophrenic vision, they start seeing things they think are real. And he's warning them, don't. It's not actually a palace. It's just a vision in your head, a way of you making sense, perhaps, of the divine inspiration that you're getting. And as long as you remember that it's all metaphor and it's just an internal experience that God is allowing your mind to have, you'll be fine. And Rabbi Akiva knew that and came out okay. But the rest of them were kind of messed up by it. Did Azai actually die because of this? Again, there's a lot of mixture of fact and legend, but the reality is Rabbi Akiva was a mystic, and he probably did have these incredible visions, and he probably was trained by previous rabbis that in the visions, you should see different kinds of palaces, different colors, you should walk through doors. There are other religions that have that, where you meditate specifically walking through the doors of a building to get closer and closer to the divine. So many traditions have this, but Rabbi Akiva knew the language. He knew the experience. He was trained in having these meditative visions. So again, something we forget about Rabbi Akiva, not only, so he was a teacher, he was a mystic, and he was, he was a guy who was always at peace. The next source here I mentioned, he was a teacher, is again another very, very famous story about him, maybe one of the most famous because it leads to a specific set of practices during the time between Pesach and Shavuot, the Omer, because during that time we have these mourning practices for men not shaving, not doing a lot of parties and stuff like that. And the reason that is given by tradition is during that time there was some sort of plague. Now, was it an actual plague, a sickness, or was it a military battle in which many, many people died? But regardless, Rabbi Akiva lived during that time. And it says in the story that it was his students that died. So why don't we jump into it? And Tamar, if you would please take source number 3.
They said, by way of example, that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of students in an area of land that stretched from Gvat to Antipatris in Judea. And they all died in one period of time before they did not treat each other.
Because they did not
treat each other with respect. And the world was desolate of Torah until Rabbi Akiva came to our rabbis in the south and taught his Torah to them. This second group of disciples consisted of Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon, and the rabbis and Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua. And these are the very ones who upheld the study of Torah at that time. Although Rabbi Akiva earlier studied did not survive, his later disciples were able to transmit the Torah to further generations. With regard to the 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students, the Gemara adds, it is taught that all of them died in the period from Passover until Shavuot. Rav Chama Bar Abba said, and some say it was Rabbi Chia Bar Avin, they all died a bad death. The Gemara inquires, what is it that is called a bad death? And Rav Nachman said, diphtheria.
Yeah, or askara in the Gemara. So this very famous story here, again, there's a lot of interesting questions about what's really going on here. Now, again, the numbers are actually consistent, even if they're potentially exaggerated. And there's actually a phrase for exaggeration in the Talmud, a guzma, which is, something that like a door that's like 10 million miles high. No one believes that's the actual number. It's just meaning to show a point, which is Rabbi Akiva had many, many students. So in his other story, it said he had 24,000 students. And here it says 12,000 pairs, which 12 times 2 is 24. So that's actually consistent there, which is nice. But the point is, it says here that his students died because they didn't respect each other. Now, this story is very much trying to teach us a couple of important lessons. One is how important respect is. And it doesn't matter how much Torah you have, and it doesn't matter if you represent the future of Judaism. If you can't show basic respect towards each other and treat each other with the respect and kindness that you deserve, then you don't deserve to pass Torah on. Rabbi Akiva, as we saw from all these stories, did have that. He was a humble and respectful person. That's why he deserved to have thousands of students. And even when they all died, he was honored with the ability to pass on Torah to the next generation. And it's those rabbis that continue to give over his teachings in the Mishnah and in the Talmud, etc., like that. Now, the background to the story is just as interesting, which again is that they were mean to each other, so they all died of diphtheria. Is it possible, plausible? Improbable, more likely. However, we do know that unfortunately Rabbi Akiva, for as great as he was, death followed him. From his martyrdom to the death of many that he was associated with. And the next source here is historically much, much later. It's not from the Talmud, it's from Rambam's Mishnah Torah, but it's going to mention another very famous moment in the life of Rabbi Akiva, in which he was associated with the death of many thousands of Jews. And it's very possible, more plausible, that the story talked about in source 4 is actually what led to the death of as many thousands of students, notwithstanding the teaching in the name or guise of Rabbi Akiva about respect. So in Mishnah Torah, Rabbi Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, is teaching the laws about the Mashiach. And one of the famous things about Maimonides is his teaching that Mashiach is not going to be supernatural. The Messiah is not going to come down on magical clouds and dragons are going to come flying in with him. It's all going to be part of our world in a very naturalistic way. So he says, Ve'al ya'aleh ve'al da'atecha, and don't think that the King Mashiach, in the Hebrew, the Melech HaMashiach, because the Mashiach is not some divine being. The Mashiach is a human being who is from the line of David, meaning that they are of royalty, and they will sit on the throne they'll be anointed and sit on the throne of Israel. So calling him Melech HaMashiach sounds weird, but it just means the anointed king, which King David was. And don't think that the King Mashiach needs to do wonders and signs to create a new reality in the world or resurrect the dead or similar things. Not that those things won't happen, but those are not powers of the Mashiach. Mashiach is just a man. This is not the point of the Messianic redemptive process. Rabbi Akiva, the wisest of the Mishnaic sages, was the weapons bearer of the king Ben Kuziba Bar Kochba. And he said concerning him, Ben Kuziba, and we'll come back to this in a moment, that he was the King Mashiach. And all the sages of the generation were in agreement until he was killed due to his sins. So during the time of the Romans, just like if you go back earlier in the time of the Greek Syrians, when the Maccabees overthrew Antiochus and got back the temple, the Jews showed that they were able to overthrow a much mightier power and gain sovereignty. Now, eventually that sovereignty was lost, and we got King Herod, who was, barely a Jew and really was a puppet to the Roman government. And the Jews said, you know what? It's time to fight again. The Maccabees did it, we can. And there was this man, Bar Koziba, or Ben Kuziba, son of Koziba, and he got the nickname Bar Kochba, son of the star. That was his militaristic general inspirational nickname. And Rabbi Akiva thought that this person, he believed he was a descendant of King David, and that he would be the leader, like Judah Maccabee, that would overthrow the Romans and gain back total sovereignty in the land of Israel. And there was an uprising, rebellion against the Romans. Did it work? I'm looking for heads. No. January 100, it absolutely failed. And it led to, you guys all got it. And it led to the death of thousands of Jews, not only in the initial battle, but when the Romans want to quash a rebellion, they make sure that the people who rebelled will never do it again. So again, we don't know for a fact, but it's very likely that that traumatic tragedy in history of the quashing of the rebellion is what the Talmud is referring to when it talks about the death of his 24,000 students. It was not necessarily his students in a yeshiva, it might have been his disciples who were going with him and Bar Kokhba on the battlefield. So that's the background of the story and the connection to the previous source. But this is how Rambam uses it. And again, talking about the legacy of Rabbi Akiva and how his very life can inspire practical halacha and philosophy. And all the sages of the generation were in agreement. Everyone agreed and said, if Rabbi Akiva says this guy is going to be Mashiach, let's rally behind him. They were wrong, unfortunately. We're in agreement until he was killed due to his sins. Now, that due to his sins thing, that's maybe an addendum, a commentary of Rambam. Why did Bar Kokhba fail? Oh, because he, wasn't a truly righteous person. Is it that, or God didn't want them to succeed? For whatever reason it was, the rebellion under Bar Kokhba failed. Since he was killed, they then knew that he was not the Mashiach. The sages did not request from him neither a sign nor a wonder, miraculous actions. The main thing is that the Torah and its laws and statutes are everlasting forever and ever, and we do not add or subtract from them. We learn from Rabbi Akiva that there could be someone who's a perfectly good human being, and you're allowed to support them as being Mashiach. But if they fail or they're killed, you move on. Now, obviously, in this case, the killing was the killing of, the death of thousands of Jews. But the other takeaway from here, besides the fact that the Mashiach will be a normal human being, is that if you believe someone is going to Mashiach and they die, you move on from there. That's it, end of story. So even in his death, the very stories about Rabbi Akiva are still influencing major Jewish philosophy and law. So before we go on to our last little section, any questions up until now? Beautiful. So this last section I called Quick Wisdom, and these are just little pithy sayings that teach about some of, some nice things that Rabbi Akiva said and some beautiful ideas that he really pushed for. So Jane, this first one, and now we're actually again makot, having to deal again with punishments related to the court, etc. So just this short Mishnah, please.
A Sanhedrin that would execute someone once in 7 years would be considered destructive. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, once in 70 years. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Akiva said, if we were on the Sanhedrin, no one would have been ever been executed. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, they too would have increased violence in Israel.
Now, whenever anyone's teaching about the Jewish view of capital punishment, this is probably the most important text. But if you said, where does Rabbi Akiva hold on capital punishment? He would say he's opposed to it. He would, if he was in charge of the Sanhedrin, he would have made sure that no one ever would have been put to death. Now, the final statement in this little section for Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said, there are some times when there's certain criminals who they deserve the death penalty. And because this is also before the concept of jail that we have today. So if they're not put to death, they go free. And what are they going to do? They're going to go out and kill more people. But our takeaway from here is Rabbi Akiva's value, the eternal value of life. And again, that optimism and that hope that nobody deserves to die. Everybody deserves a second chance. This next source here is, again, also incredibly important and famous. It's one of the most fundamental ethical questions that to this day we ask. So Gloria, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Oh, sorry, I may have accidentally muted you again. I'm not going to touch anything. Okay, good. So this is in the section Bava Metzia, which deals with civil and law, generally with civil and monetary laws. So go ahead, please.
Two people are traveling along the way, and one of them has in his possession a flask of water. If both drink from it, they will both die. However, if only one of them drinks, he will be able to make it out of the desert. Ben Petura expounded, it is better that both should drink and die than that one should witness the death of his fellow. Then Rabbi Akiva came and taught, your brother shall live with you. Your life comes first before the life of your friend.
So this is really interesting, and we could spend an entire class, and perhaps I will in the future, on this. I think I have actually done one similar. It's like the famous trolley problem. If there's a trolley on a track, and if it keeps going, it's going to hit 5 people. But if you pull a lever, it'll go to another track, but it'll hit 1 person. So how do you decide the value of life? So this first rabbi, so there's 1 flask of water for 2 people. They cannot both survive. And Ben Batora says, share it. Better that they should die together than that one of them should, either give up his life or cause his friend to give up his life. But Rabbi Akiva says, no, your life comes first. It's like on an airplane when they say if the oxygen mask comes down, put on your mask first, because how are you going to help anyone else? How are you going to help anyone else if you yourself are dead? And this principle actually shows up a lot of times in Judaism. like with Shabbat. And, why would we break Shabbat to save life? Because if we're dead, we can't do Shabbat. There's certain values that just don't work. If one's life ends, they cannot live a life of Torah. They can't do anything else. So people can certainly disagree with this, but this is Rabbi Akiva's take on the value of life. And, it's not about your friend doesn't matter. It's about you have to protect your own life. The next line there is just simple and beautiful. So Gloria, you can take that short one from the Jerusalem Talmud, which again, we rarely get chances to read text from the Talmud Yerushalmi, please.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Rabbi Akiva said, this is the most important rule in the Torah.
As I said, he's an eternal optimist and he's just the sweetest guy. And this is an example of it. This is what is attributed to him. Now, when I say attributed, as I said, there are certain stories that we kind of raise our eyebrows and say, did that really happen that way? But the fact is, he was a teacher and he taught hundreds, perhaps thousands of students. So if not 100%, then certainly a significant amount of the things that are attributed to him, he probably did say in one form or the other. Because with that kind of stature, the whole point of his class of rabbis, his generation, they were called the Tanaim, the repeaters, because they would basically remember and recite the oral tradition. They would pass it down verbatim. So the reality is much of what Rabbi Akiva actually said probably is recorded with high accuracy. The stories about him may have been created as legends later, but a lot of the Torah was almost certainly said by him, perhaps even word for word. And the last source here I'll take, as I said, he was a rabbi in the time, or actually right before the time of the Mishnah. So he was included in Pirkei Avot. So there's actually a number of sayings attributed to him. Actually, I cut them out. It says here 13 through 16 are all his, but I only brought 13 because I thought it was really lovely. So Rabbi Akiva says, Schok vekalo, joking and lightheartedness, acclimate one towards promiscuity. So I don't know if I agree with him on that one, but he basically means if you're not taking things seriously, you're going to treat everything as a joke and you're going to end up, being inappropriate. Tradition is a safeguarding, and he says, Masoret, that which is passed down, fence around the Torah. And again, that's a very famous rabbinic teaching, which is that the Torah itself is so sacred and important that the traditions about how to keep it are there to protect us, to protect God's law. And he says, tithes are a safeguarding fence around wealth, which means that if I really want to stay rich, then I should make sure that I give a little bit of my wealth to everyone around me. And the reason that's not just a beautiful, righteous thing to do is if all of the money in the world ends up in the hand of 5 billionaires, society will collapse and the money of those billionaires will be worthless. But if everybody is successful, then even the richest people will be more successful for it. When everyone does well and society is strong, then the stock market's good, et cetera, like that. So this isn't just nice pipe dream stuff. This is some really good advice there about investing and what to invest in people. Vows are a safeguarding fence around abstinence. And again, he's getting into, we're not going to unpack everything he says about the kind of life he wants you to lead. As safeguarding fence around wisdom is silence. Sometimes the best lesson, the best thing to teach is just be quiet and listen. That's Rabbi Akiva in a nutshell. Again, there's so much more to him, things that are taught in his name, halachic legal conversations that I didn't include, and I hope people will go out there. There's books written about him, turned into a biography, and perhaps those books try and separate fact from fiction, legend from reality, but in some ways that's not the point. We know he was a real man. We know he was a great teacher. So there are things that we can be certain he said, but even the things we're not certain about can inspire us. So the reason that Rabbi Akiva is considered one of the greatest rabbis in history is not because of his brilliance, that's part of it, but how he chose to use that brilliance, how he treated other people with respect, his eternal optimism. And even if you don't go out there and become a Torah scholar and all the nitpicky things about civil laws, there's still so much you can learn about Rabbi Akiva by being a good person, about listening, about kindness, about loving everyone around you. And the most important lesson of all is listen to your wife.